In an effort to better understand how plants can help us colonize the cosmos, scientist Matthew G. Lehmitz has been working on something called PlantSat, a small satellite which contains a plant, and the plan is to launch it into orbit of the freaking Earth. I'm Felix on Future Imminent, here today to talk with them about this exciting endeavor. Matthew, how are you doing today?
I am doing very well, thank you.
So, why did you choose the sky plant, probably known as Tillandsia aenartha?
Tillandsia ionantha. The typical term that I've heard at least is air plant, but same basic concept. It was chosen specifically to try to avoid some of the greater challenges that are involved with spaceflight, especially where plants are concerned. The Tillandsias are a broad group, but many of them don't require any kind of rooting system. And so this means that you basically can put them on top of a desk, on top of a rock, on a piece of metal, etc., and they will grow without any significant issue. This means that we can reduce the amount of soil required to zero and limit the water. And if we're not having to take that with us and to maintain the material, it means that it's much easier and cheaper to get something like this into orbit and to do testing on it and to provide in the long term resources for people who will be developing ecosystems and habitats to live in space and on other worlds.
How do you take it from a plant that's easy to grow, for example, a potato?
There are definitely pros and cons. This species is edible, but it doesn't grow terribly fast, isn't all that tasty, and because it requires so little in terms of resources, including varieties of nutrients, it's not particularly nutritious to eat. It tastes similar to that of lettuce when I was chewing on it in the past. Potato, of course, is a fast-growing little tuber that's been edited by crossbreeding and by various farming methods for hundreds of years in order to make it the most useful food product. It takes up everything from the soil and becomes actually quite nutritious. You can survive for quite a while eating just potatoes and be reasonably healthy doing it. That is a major difference between them in terms of their value, and we're going to want to eventually take them all along and have a lot of different species in order to make a stable and healthy habitat, as one species alone will never succeed in that way.
What is the time you would like it to last up there in orbit of the Earth?
Our goal is 1 year. We shall see whether or not we make it to that point, but if we do, that's excellent, and hopefully we can go well beyond that.
What kind of data are you guys hoping to get out of this? Just see how much it grows relative to the ground? Are you having a control plant in climate-controlled room on Earth or something?
Not just climate control, but control of all the variables. We want to be able to test everything on Earth and on other worlds, and we want to make sure that as we do so, we can test for all the variables in orbit as well. So we're going to make it so that we have microgravity as close as we can get it on Earth by rotational disks. We're going to go with radiation environments to see how our shielding is doing to protect the plant. We're going to want to put it in vacuum chambers and make sure we don't have any leaks, as that would, of course, be very unpleasant, and on down the line. That will help a great deal to ensure that when we do put it into orbit, we're not going to have any unforeseen complications. We only have the one opportunity to test it right now. Certainly don't want to squander that in any way. We're also going to be putting the species into airtight chambers and environments to see how they're going to fare over extended periods of desiccation and other internal elements to the test chamber and the environment itself, so that we can begin the first steps toward regenerative biosystems in orbit.
A lot of people can't seem to keep plants alive in their own backyard. Do you grow anything at home? Do you have a garden?
Yes, we have a small garden out in the backyard here. It usually does fairly well, and we get a lot of various fruits and vegetables out of it. It is notable that the most successful part tends to be things like the fruit trees, and that is in large part because they are mostly self-sustaining. You don't have to do a lot with them, but they still produce a large quantity of usable material without the need for huge inputs. And in that regard, it's similar to what we want to do with this project. Minimum inputs, but valuable outputs.
What do you use to keep your atmosphere inside the CubeSat from escaping into space?
Essentially, it's just a sealed chamber. At the time of launch, we're going to seal it up with the atmosphere that we want, which will probably have things like higher levels of CO2 in order to provide for the plant in the long term. At that point, that's about it. The atmosphere is what we have, and since it doesn't have any outlet or inlet, there's nowhere for the atmosphere to go, and that is how we're going to keep it there throughout the mission.
No leaks of any kind, you hope at least.
The course plans are not perfect. As I said, though, we're going to test it as far as possible, reinforce it at least a little bit just in case we run into anything. But space is a hostile environment. It's hard to engineer perfectly for.
I was also wondering, visual monitoring. You mentioned in the paper that you'll be using a camera to watch it, obviously. What is it?
This is much more like a phone camera, just that little piece of the phone that you have. And those can get very high quality images now, not just in the visible spectrum, one will expect. We'll certainly have that as well to see how it's doing, but we also want them into the other ranges of light, the ultraviolet and infrared, as far as we can achieve that. And that will provide additional information about things like how much water the plant has and how it's doing in terms of growth rates.
Another thing I was curious about is you're very strict with some nutrients. In your paper, you discuss there are separate canisters for, I believe it was the nitrogen, and you put it into the main chamber selectively based off of sensors you have. But with water, you just let it be inside the main chamber.
In order to simplify matters, we probably will not be keeping the gases all in separate chambers because that's going to create a lot of weaknesses that increase the likelihood that we start leaking gases into space or having additional moving parts that have a potential to break down. Talking with the engineers, that seems less likely over time. As far as the water goes, we just want it to cycle essentially, just like we would see in a natural environment or in a closed ecosystem here on Earth. The water goes through the water cycle. It heats up a little bit and it goes to vapor, and then it goes back into a liquid as it cools and falls out of suspension in the atmosphere. And keeping the water mostly warm enough and the satellite or the chamber at least itself warm enough to keep the majority of water as a gas is going to be part of the goal of the thing. We want to have 100% humidity as much of the time as possible in order to make sure that the plant has access to water that it needs to survive. Otherwise, the water is going to basically pool out on the base of the satellite and provide something of a reservoir which we can use to continue to supply that needed water for the plant.
You state that the overall goal here is to have a regenerative ecosystem without human intervention.
Yes, the idea is to be a self sustaining bioregenerative ecosystem. It basically will take care of itself or as close as possible without any direct human intervention, although, at least in this case, there will be some degree of robotic or automated intervention.
So let's say that NASA comes to you and they ask you, given the space we have available on the ISS and a budget of, let's say, $100 million, what can you do?
Oh, a great deal. With $100 million, we could build quite a large self sustaining ecosystem and create several versions of it so we can get redundant testing and actually have ones that will be testing specific novel concepts and others that will be control elements. We would be able to expand that, hopefully, to actually create an entire chamber or sealed section of the International Space Station using some little addition that we could put people in for a limited time and see what effect that would have on the ecosystem as a long-term step. It would also be excellent to grow crops that would be of greater use directly in that space and see if we can generate effective soils over time to really build a full ecosystem along with animals, probably small ones such as insects. We grow our own meat to add to a diet and also add the animal element to the ecosystem as it requires multiple different species, including animals and fungi, to go through the entire regenerative cycle to reclaim all of the nutrients, to have a gas balance, and etc.
Let's say that goes through. Now NASA is giving you full control over the design of a new long-term habitat in space. How would you grow plants, for example, on Europa or Titan?
If we figured out how to grow them in orbit in space, then we use that same box and we just put it on Europa or Titan and start growing things in it. Weaker sunlight is going to be a challenge, but if we have some kind of energy generation, whether it be nuclear or thermal, we're going to have a source of energy to provide all the heat and everything else one way or another on these places if humans are going, or if any living thing is going. And once we have that, we have a little bit of extra energy to put into supplemental lighting systems to provide for the plants. Once we have that box figured out, we can make slight alterations to it and then hook it up to various energy sources and take it wherever we need.
The early stages of this box is what you're working on launching later this year. And what's going to happen to your satellite after that year is up?
Assuming it is still usable, that the plant is still alive, that nothing has happened to the satellite to make it non-functional, we'll continue to monitor and get as much useful information from it as we can. At whatever point it is clear that either the satellite is not functional or usable, or the plant has died and is providing no further useful information, we essentially just sever the connection. In less than a decade, the satellite will re-enter the atmosphere, burn up, and eliminate itself as potential space junk.
And so goes the end of Planty? Have you given the plant a name?
No, we haven't named the plant. Thought specifically about naming the plant, but open to suggestions.
I like Mr. Plant. No. All right. Well, we've come to the end of our questions. So if there's anything else you would like to say, or if there are any projects you would like to let our viewers know that you're working on, go ahead.
Well, this is definitely going to be something we hope to carry further into the future. Certainly this is PlantSat, but we're hoping it's just PlantSat 1 of many, and that we can take this and expand it not just in size and scope, but also in duration over time, so that we can have longer experiments with multiple species to see where this can really go. And we're also going to be working on greenhouses on Earth, closed loop greenhouses, so we can do much larger experiments with lower cost and logistical issues, also ones that we can either leave alone or make certain alterations to along the way, depending on what will be most valuable toward the experiment. There are currently plans to work on one of these in Washington, and hopefully more of them will become available. Within that space, there is opportunity for more people to become involved if they wish, especially if we want to duplicate some of the experiments we're currently working on to provide additional useful data that we can then add to this and create an aggregate of multiple experiments being run, which will be much more useful in terms of replication over time so that we can be more certain of our outcomes. So there's, I guess they call it citizen science opportunities there.
That is one way that people can help out if they want to.
Much so.
Well, that is it. Thanks for coming on to Future Imminent, and I hope you have a good day.
I'm certain that I will. Thank you very much.
I don't do this alone, and I sure wouldn't want to. As the host of Future Imminent, it is my pleasure to thank Nick Gertson for producing, Quinn Cummins-Loon, and several others for their assistance in making this possible, and members of the Futurist Foundation for providing us with the music for Future Imminent.